Thank you, Eileen, and Ware for inviting me to this very interesting session to discuss and think about these topics. So first of all, Luis, it's very nice to see you and to also learn about the work that you have done. The topic of how climate will influence health is gaining a lot of enthusiasm right now. So I also have been very interested in thinking about these research questions. And as mentioned, this has very large implications on considering the current public health agenda. I think the challenging thing for all of us who has interest in this area is wrestling with is methodological issues. CRELES provides very interesting opportunity to study this research questions, but we need to be really thinking about this fixed effect model. What does it capture, and whether the study design allow us to think about the weather-related fluctuation from like biological changes over time. I think 2-year time window is short enough. So maybe we are not expecting to see a lot of variations during that time, but still I think it will be helpful for us to like control for the stroke, for example, if it has happened during that 2-year time window, or any sort of a very stressful life events, for example, death in the family has happened during those 2-year time window. Being able to control for those potential driver of the change will be very important. And the other thing is, I think CRELES is very strong methodologically making sure that all the biomarker measures are consistently done by very highly trained small team of member interviewing field team members. However, it actually requires quite deliberation. As we've been looking into various biomarker measurements, I start to worry a lot more about whether like blood pressure monitor is calibrated over time. So it tends to fluctuate a lot, and that's something that we encourage field team to take a look at it. And a lot of the small little details can make a huge difference in those kind of measurements. And especially since we are looking at how in the fixed effect model, the differences we observe in during those 2-year time window is really driven by climate change is a very difficult empirical finding to establish. So we need to be a little bit more sober about that. The finding itself is quite interesting. It is really interesting to see the total cholesterol matters so much, and I wonder which part of the world I should live in, right? If we see such a big, huge variations. But then I start to also wonder, so what is really driving this? What is the biological explanation that did we really hypothesize to see the temperature or the amount of the rain outside will have tied to the cholesterol levels or any other biomarkers? So I think before we take a step forward, there may be important conceptual questions that we have to ask ourselves to be able to provide more theoretical insights rather than just whatever we observe from the data itself. But again, I really applaud the effort and start helping us to thinking about these very important research questions. The second paper is actually the topic that I have worked a lot myself in this area of thinking about the cascade of non-communicable disease. And when we think about the non-communicable disease challenges, we start with the cascade approach. like thinking about the awareness, whether the people are aware they do have high blood pressure, whether they have diabetes, and then getting into diagnosis stage and getting the treatment and being able to control for their blood pressure and being able to control for their blood sugar. When I worked on this area, what I found quite interesting is it is beyond the awareness. A lot of times, actually, clinical guidelines for diagnosis of the hypertension or clinical guidelines for diabetes actually varies across the country. And also the guideline itself changes over time. So that's just important to just double check what is the national guideline. And I was surprised by when I worked on the countries and such guidelines have changed over time. And that also sort of has implications for whether or not they are taking any medications, right? And when we think about the treatment, I think the hypertension medication is quite cheap in many of the countries, and it is actually provided even without any expenses to the respondents. So there is definitely variations on how costly the treatment itself is especially when we start thinking about like SES types of gradient. The other interesting thing that I've been observing in low and middle income country setting is many of the people actually taking a different treatment, especially the countries like China and India. There are a lot of alternative medicine. And I have seen many older adults go to those more traditional medical health providers, and they like tend to prescribe like taking like handful of spices, which is very interesting, right? And they are not getting statins. Instead, they are getting like a huge dosage of spices. So it will be interesting to think about what kind of treatment that people are taking. And then finally, the control issues, right? Let's say you are in the health sector and getting the diagnosis done and getting the treatment and being able to follow the medication and taking the whatever the things that you are supposed to do is a very hard job for many people, and we see a lot of gradients there. So being able to like think about cascade of non-communicable disease will be very interesting. Then we can tie it back to the patterns that we have seen today, right? In Colombia, we see a lot of self-reported hypertension is much higher than the measured. And is it really because people are better because they know they have high blood pressure, so they don't take salt and they are just being able to control their blood pressure better? I mean, it is a question. We don't know whether that's exactly what we're seeing. And in the same time, in China, we see self-reported hypertension is lower than measured. What does that mean, right? Is it really undiagnosed? I think that's like more widely accepted interpretation, but this is just all we have to think very carefully. A couple of colleagues of mine, Pascal at Stanford and Eddie Meyer at USC, wrote a paper recently looking at interviewer effect in measuring hypertension. And I was very worried when that paper started because we like introduce interviewer variable into the equation and see what we observe. And when the team found out that there is no significant interviewer effect, I was just so relieved. So that is really good news for all of us who are working on this field. And finally, the Indian HbA1c data is ready. We're just waiting for our approval from the government of India. So you will see the data very soon in the public domain. And now finally, that's by the network. It is such an interesting paper. I agree, this is a very novel, and I was quite excited about thinking about these approaches while I was reviewing your demo slide. I can definitely see the various trade-off. depending on the methodological approaches that have been taken. But I also wonder, whether we can collaborate more traditional approaches in, asking deaths in the household in the last 2 years, right? When we ask them, there is definitely a bias among those people who are in single household, as pointed out. But at the same time, we do know like what percent of population is living in single household from the census. So through the calibration exercise, we may be able to get that more closer to the death rate or mortality rate that we are interested in. And I wonder that may be a much easier exercise to do rather than thinking through the social ties. As you pointed out, there are a lot of measurement error associated with it. So it's a question. I'm sure there might be some answers. You can enlighten me on this very topic. And then when we think about the, these quality indicators of comparing different approaches to so-called gold standard is, I think that makes a lot of sense in rural settings, but it may be very hard to accomplish in urban settings, right? And especially in many of the low and middle income countries, they are developing, and in the urban areas, they are like completely wipe out the buildings and rebuild the whole condominium buildings or whatever. So it is maybe you need to think a little bit more carefully across different urbanicity in getting at this mortality, excessive mortality in those settings. So those are some of my thoughts, and thanks again for the opportunity to think about these very interesting research questions.